afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Middle East and Africa Forum for Sustainability Leaders podcast, where we take a deeper dive into this massive push that we're seeing across the region towards sustainability, trying to uncover some intelligence insights that will help leaders who are navigating this road forward. We're lucky to be here today with our special guest speaker, Dimitra Theodoropoulos, Director of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability at Talabat. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
I just wanted to first start with a kind of a broader question. Of course, we have listeners and viewers from across the region, but also internationally. What essentially is Talabat at its core? Is it a food delivery company? Is it a technology company? Is it a digital marketplace? What are your thoughts on that perspective?
This is a tricky question, but I think at the core of our business and of what we're trying to do, we are a tech company. And this is why we haven't ventured into necessarily having our own fleet of riders. And, much like the Ubers of the world, we've stuck in the sense of like, we want to continue working on the tech part. And that could actually enable a lot of different services that as an average customer, you don't see, right? But that we're working on. Sort of around AI, around how you order, around app personalization, around many actually cool things happening. So, I mean, it's hard for us to say that we're not also a logistics company because obviously, we take responsibility of that arm, even though it's not necessarily in-house. But we usually like to say we're a tech company because these are where all the sort of focus and innovation is coming from.
Well, from that perspective, I believe Talabat was launched in 2004, probably coming up on 20 years now. When do you think was the first, point in time that was identified that sustainability would be, a key part of the drive forward for the organization, and especially setting up a sustainability department?
So I think obviously a lot of recently a lot of it came in 2015 we were acquired by Delivery Hero, which is a German publicly listed company. And I think this is where initially that first wave of, okay, we need someone there came, or at least the idea. As part of our non-financial reports, we do, are sort of obliged and also required. And also there's a certain level of investor expectation, right? So I think this is where I think the idea was born. I would say external push, but also there has been an internal one, right? And that goes to say our group CEO, Nicholas, he always says that, okay, we are obviously, making a business, we need to make a profitable business, but we also need to make a business where what we leave off is actually sort of better for our children, right? And he has children. A lot of us also do, or at least are in families who have. And I think this sense of responsibility of what you leave off for the next generation is something that, regardless of being publicly listed, as sort of in the already in the DNA and is being led by our C-level.
And how do you balance that, right? It's kind of a very tough position to. We always go back to the people, planet, profit aspect. How do you balance that in a sense? We're constantly looking to add value, not just to the sustainability aspect, but also to the overall business and platform essentially. How did those intertwine, and what has your been experience in doing that?
I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's tough because the business is not set up necessarily to even look at sustainable opportunities, right? Because they're very different than your conventional, very like targeted bottom line sort of, okay, this is what we're going to do. These are how many users we're going to get. And I think the struggle has been sort of actually working on, engaging with internal stakeholders on recreating a process where sustainability opportunities are able to be prioritized and identified in a way where they're also compared to these other opportunities, right? And this is where sort of more of that sort of not financial, but economic sort of appraisals go, right? And I think this is something that, it's very easy, to go in as a sustainability lead and to say, this is what I did last month, and to be very output and campaigny driven, right? And right now, I think what we're trying to do is actually, change the business internally for it to be there, and for it to be thriving, right? And I think this is really, really key. So I don't try to sort of rock the boat and coming up with big ideas. I try to go down to the foundational levels and say, okay, finance team, this is how you look at an opportunity. This is how we could be looking at it, and this is why. Even how, we do other aspects of the organization, right? How we look at safety for our riders, how we sort of, bringing all these aspects of sustainability into the business where they actually sit, and not having it as something completely separate or something that is there as sort of on that nice PR day, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask a follow-up question to that. I think something you mentioned sustainability lead, right? It's very hard thing to define, I think, at the end of the day as well, in terms of whether it's a CSO or whatever the leader might be. For example, we had a conversation with a energy company yesterday where the CSO's background was in finance, right? Just saw an article on fashion where some of the CSOs were actually in manufacturing or mining, which is a little bit different. What does that aspect in terms of sustainability lead mean to you, and how you essentially define it? Is it efficiency? Is it productivity? Of course, also green in that sense.
I think for me, it's sort of I would say it's someone with a sort of someone with a strategy, planning, and execution background would do really well in this role, right? And I think because essentially that's what it is, or that's what sustainability is to me. It is not something that is separate. It's sort of a different approach to how you do business, right? And as such, it's sort of a strategy that you sort of implement and that you execute. Now, I do think that whoever leads this definitely needs to be okay with change, and definitely needs to be okay with ambiguity, and with actually doing many different things based on where the company is at in terms of maturity, based on how they are able to get better buy-in or showcase the topic in the way they want to represent it. So I would say as someone with a jack of all trades, and so this is why I don't necessarily see, sometimes, mining backgrounds, as you say, are frowned upon, and like, why are they? And I don't actually believe that that is as important as a person sort of more of those soft skills, right? And more of that execution strategy and execution arm that we see. I think I saw an article on Deloitte the other day where it said like the key traits are not only strategy, planning, and execution of a sustainability lead, but also sort of ecosystem co-creation. So I really sort of, and leave it to the consultants to come up with these kind of words. I'm not in that space, but I do believe that that's actually a really important word because really you're sort of trying to create value in all parts of the organization, and not only internally, but leveraging and the external part as well. So it's quite a daunting sort of
that's a long list of skill sets you'd have to put on LinkedIn. I think you'd keep clicking for days if that's the case. But I think you touched on kind of that big point of thinking about doing business differently, and that's a mindset, right? And I think that co-creation of that ecosystem, it also is a kind of a daunting task as well. From your aspect and from your perspective in terms of a corporate governance level, how do you implement that mindset across the organization? What's been your experience? Sustainability, there's not many silos. It requires everyone to be collaborative and be on board regardless of segments, let's say.
Yeah, I would say you have to appeal to sort of what's important to that individual team or market, or depending on how you're dividing up your topics. But I think you can always start small in terms of like trying, cost reduction is a key component of sustainability, right? And nobody talks about it. And it's not like a fun one. You don't obviously also want to use it as a way to market yourself as sustainable because you're using less fuel. But to be fair, you have to start somewhere. And sometimes I don't understand why we shy away from talking more about cost reductions and sustainability, because it's a very, especially within the business world.
It's a form of waste, right?
It's a form of waste, of course. It could be in the beginning of your, supply chain, at the end, wherever it is in the business. That's the same. You're speaking the same language as the rest of the people, and this is where you have to start, right? Because if you start, adding all these complicated words, mitigation, adaptation, they start losing you and actually start getting very scared of sustainability. In their minds, they think of it as, oh, more investment. And while that's true in some cases, I mean, I always say to my other teams, it's like, imagine the marketing team with no budget, right? Of course there needs to be a budget, or else you can only do limited number of things. So it's not to say that you don't need something. It's a team. It needs to be set up for success. But I do think the long-term gain here is cost in the beginning, cost reduction. And for us at Talabat, that's a huge lever, right? Because we're in a stakeholders.
I just wanted to broaden out kind of with the next question as well. Talabat, technology company, highly active in the region. Obviously constantly evolving. We have COP28, we had COP27 last year in the region as well. But what are some of the emerging trends that you see for sustainability leaders and sustainability initiatives to watch out for in 2023 at the moment, as we lead into probably a pretty very busy period the next few months?
I mean, as someone in a company where obviously our tech is pretty big, I can't avoid the word AI, right? But I do think in for us, it's actually going to be a great tool for sustainability. Already we're seeing, looking into cost efficient routes, sort of smarter technology. We've recently now implemented electric vehicles that have sort of this smart technology within them to be able to sort of add on to that efficiency. So I do think there's a large opportunity, not only in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of how customers order. So we have this new feature now where you actually go to. So part of our business, we have something called T-Marts, which is like dark grocery stores. So basically, it's not a grocery store you can enter and buy. It's basically just an online store, but that's actually run by Talabat. And what's really cool about it is that recently we launched a feature where we showcased you going in there and saying, hey, I want to make spaghetti bolognese. And actually what it tells you is specifically all the ingredients and how much of the ingredients you need, and actually adds them to your basket, right? And I think that sort of mentality around, being able to cook more efficiently, being able to promote more sort of, in more environmental products, right? I think these kind of, sort of customer sort of influencing behavior features will be sort of really, really interesting in this year and in the coming years. I do also want to highlight, I mean, when we talk about trends, sometimes they're really fancy, right? Like, okay, AI for me is sort of
The
that
fourth
fun
industrial revolution.
Yeah.
No.
But I do want to highlight on something that's a little more, not as fun, but very important, is honest and consistent disclosure. I think to me, it's something that I saw at COP27, to my surprise, being discussed in many panels, much more than I expected, and especially around scope 3 emissions, right? So I think we're very quick to jump to a lot of these, nice, fun solutions. And at the same time, there's many companies, and I'm not going to name any big ones, who are still not actually fully assessing their scope 3 emissions. So I think that will be a trend, because they will be, pushed to do so. And I know that in the next COP, it'll be even more important to understand, okay, how do you address your big emission categories, right? I do also think, circularity is taking shape in the sense of like, okay, as a buzzword, I would say it's out there, but especially in our regions, just I think a lot of startups are starting to address sort of the challenges within this sort of circularity topic, right? So for example, we recently partnered with like a last mile recycler and a smart app last mile recycler called Nadira. And basically what they do is that, okay, the bigger waste management companies, actually that's the biggest challenge, is that they don't address this last mile sort of recovery, I would say, right? And this is what this company is fulfilling. And what they're doing is they're using AI, back to that first point, to actually scan what you input in these bins. So it's sort of, imagine in a community, you have this recycling bin, you are able to drop off many different materials. So really not putting it up to the consumer to sort of start segregating, but of course within a spectrum. And you input these items in this bin, and it actually tells you, based on your profile that you registered, how well you've recycled. And it actually scans every item and says, okay, the AI says this is good, this is not, this is what was missing in this one, this is what could have been done better. And I think these kind of combination of sort of addressing this last mile recycling plus education is exactly the kind of sort of solutions that we need.
I think one see-through point through all those trends, whether it's AI or honesty and transparency, or trying to embed a circular model within, whether it's internal or external, is data. We talk about gathering data, whether it's for metrics or developing standards. Where do you see that aspect in terms of data for sustainability in the region? And there's so much information. What's your advice on companies who are looking to develop their sustainability strategies and add those trends that you're speaking on to their, let's say, toolbox?
I think there's sort of, I've heard this from a lot of people, oh, we're too small to do any of this. And I think that's a really, really wrong approach. And while, yes, it does require a bit of resourcing, etc., I do think that from bigger to smaller, you're in no position, like everybody should start on this journey, right? And I think the data part could be overwhelming. And I think what most people sort of do is, or I found in my experience, is that they want to do everything perfectly, right? And as many of us know, in the data world, there's no such thing. A lot of analysis have, sort of gaps in them, right? They're supposed to be read in a certain way and actually supposed to be built on. This is what scientific journals do all the time. There's no conclusion that ends the discussion, right? It sort of is something that builds on different points that then evolve. And I think, smaller companies should just focus on the basics. So basically starting with your scope 1 and 2 is a good start. And I think will obviously also help you in any cost reduction or any sort of new opportunity, right, as well. I think then you can start then adding scope 3. And I think the most important part is you're not alone, right? And I think there's a lot of resources out there, and I think people struggle to find where to go. I think specifically, let's take the UAE for an example. There's a new actually association called, or alliance actually, called the UAE Alliance for Climate Action. And they cater to any size company. It's actually led by Emirates Nature, and the knowledge partner there is BCG, and HSBC is actually sponsoring it. And it enables, if you join this sort of alliance, basically everybody's on a different journey. And what they do is that they have sessions and they offer tools for free on how to start on this path. So they can offer like they have a cool Excel tool where they've already populated all of these information and emission factors and things that are quite standard. And they basically enable smaller companies to to start, right? And and I think being ready for the data to change is also something that you have to be okay with. So we've calculated our carbon footprint comprehensively for the last 2 years. And I think as someone who's worked in other functions, you're not able to sort of sometimes compare apples to apples, right? Because the way the data has been produced is a better quality the second year, but we can't really use historical data, right? And so I think it's being in a place where, you focus on like the bigger items sort of within your supply chain on making sure that that's of certain quality. And then every year, just sort of developing that quality as you go. So I think these 2 points are really interesting and important. I think there's help out there and very, very easy tools to use to start. And three, like your data is never going to be accurate, but as long as you're trying to be accurate in the areas that really matter, right? And what I mean by that is, it's very easy for a company to know, okay, if for us, for Talabat, I would say, what are the areas that you think as a business where we have our biggest emissions, for example?
I just wanted to go broader on that as well. More so with just the region in general. You mentioned a good example of the UAE there with the association and the opportunities there for companies to engage. You've obviously had experience around the world, education in the US, experience in Europe, and being from Europe as well, and of course here in the Middle East. What do you see different in terms of the Middle East drives towards sustainability compared to other regions or the rest of the world? What do you think has been kind of the key aspects that's helped facilitate a lot of the initiatives that we're discussing today?
I think there's a government role that is much bigger than anything I've ever experienced before. So I do think that I think that part is very, when you're sort of leading these initiatives, I think working with the government, understanding their agenda, understanding their priorities, I think is key. I think another key thing is I think there's still very much a lot of ambiguity around what sustainability is, right? And I think that adds on to the complication of like, okay, is it only environmental? Is it social? Is it also, D&I? Is it all these different things? And I think that confusion sometimes leads you to sort of, not even you could be invited in panels and the discussion could be completely something you don't actually lead, right? And I think, that aspect is quite interesting. I do think that, there's a lot of, sometimes, I think the region is very new, right, in a sense. So I think it's also important, at least in the GCC, right? And I think it's important to note that, these places didn't exist like a couple of decades ago, right? So the fact that they exist now means that there's a lot more opportunity for change to happen faster than in other places, right? And
It's like comparing Rome to Neom in Saudi, right? It's two different sides of the aisle.
and I truly believe that there's going to be a massive change in the business, and I think a lot of sustainability practices will actually come also from the region. I think it's very, I'm in many different calls where EU is referenced a lot, and of course they've done an amazing job and they've progressed a lot more than many other parts of the world. But I do think that the region doesn't only need also regulation, right? So I think a lot of private companies are taking it upon themselves and are actually influencing governments. And I think this is, going back to my first point, this is actually really what's interesting about the region is, and not in the sense of, I'm a US born, I understand lobbying and all these things. I don't mean it in that way, but what I find really, really like appealing is that, you go into these conversations and yes, there's a lot of things that are tied to the government, but they're also very open, right? So I've been in many conversations where if you bring the business case to them, if you outline what you're really trying to do, they're very open to amend current policy, to relook at something. And it might take a bit of time sometimes to get through the right channels, but once you're there, I think there's a lot of appetite for change and for fast change. And one last point there is I have to state that, back to the government conversation, is that they're very open to um, economic development, right? And I think this is where it comes down to, they really want to protect you as a company and saying, okay, we don't want to hurt you by putting in this regulation. And I think this is where a lot of the criticism comes as well, right? Because they say, oh, you guys haven't moved fast enough in this. But they're also considering, hey, we're going to, kill these many jobs, right? And we don't want to do that. I'll give you a recent example. Is this, they have a regulation now around plastic bags. And actually there's an upcoming ban in January on all plastic bags. And what they were, and this has been in the making for a while. And rather than going, okay, we're just banning everything tomorrow, they realized that if you do that, there's no alternative, right? I mean, there are alternative ways, but they take a bit of time, right? And I think, that part has been really interesting, that, okay, they want to do things, but they want to do things also considering the businesses that are thriving in these different regions, right?
I think actually 25 to 30 minutes goes by pretty quickly. Before we wrapped up, I just want to ask kind of one final question. You're a former director of talent development. It's a conversation that we always have with our stakeholders, especially in the space of sustainability, in terms of developing talent, attracting talent, recruiting talent in this space. What advice can you give in terms of that aspect, and from your experience, of the best way path forward for stakeholders to take?
In terms of what skills should be
Developing talent, attracting talent, retaining talent, sustainability. It's I don't know how many people have sustainability in their job titles today who are looking to go into it. So it's kind of an evolving process. But I do know that it's a big priority and risk for many stakeholders in terms of getting that talent to help accelerate their drives towards sustainability.
Yeah, this one is a tough one because it relies a lot on someone's also curiosity and drive, right? I do think that if you make a compelling case, I think you would find most people are actually, to my surprise, most people are actually very interested, but they're not very educated. So I think in terms of what is really sustainability, other than this word we see in articles and in the news and all this stuff, is drilling it down to the place where you say, okay, as an individual, you don't need a master's or a PhD, right? Like you can start applying sustainability in your current role. And that has a lot to do with your employee engagement sort of initiative. And something that we actually recently launched now at Talabat is sort of where employees can sort of contribute to or become ambassadors or understand how within their own function they can be more sustainable. And I think if you do that, you start actually opening a lot of doors for them as well. Because what I often find is they find, a lot of people find my job very interesting because they find theirs very monotonous. And I always go back and tell them, in procurement, for example, there's a million ways you can be more sustainable, right? And you can, redo your policy and make it more sustainable. And I think doing these baby steps is actually a really, really great opportunity for people to feel like, okay, I don't, it's not this overwhelming, learning growth opportunity that I have to undertake to go into sustainability. I think it's going to this sustainability leaders are going to be born by different, by having positions in different parts of the business, and also starting to be more educated in terms of okay, what does it mean around the frameworks, around different reporting, around all these different things. But I do think that it will start by sort of fulfilling this internal sort of, oh wow, then I'm already doing my job and I can just do this and just do it differently, right? And then by default, you've actually maybe changed a big part of how, for example, we procure our goods, right? So I think starting off, and that will give fulfillment, right, to that person. And then they will want to do more, and then they will want to learn more. And that could mean, more certificates, maybe go out and actually more on an educational path. But I do think that, once you have that click, once you understand how like it's not as daunting as it seems, I think that's where you have people like switching over to being more sustainable, right?
Well, thank you very much, Dimitra, for taking your time today to share your insights. For all those listening and watching, please feel free to follow Dimitra on social media, as well as Talabat, and of course, Gulf Intelligence, where we'll be publishing this interview and the content that comes from it. But thank you very much again for your time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having you again in one of our future series and podcasts over the coming months. Thank you very much.